enlightenment is simply the perception, the experience of reality as it actually is when the mind and the emotional body isn't distorting it.
So what's the experience of, how most people then are experiencing reality?
Yeah. Well, most people are experiencing reality, of course, through their mind, which means most people's what's real to most people is the contents of their minds, right? What they believe, what they think, what they imagine, people's image of themselves, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes indifferent, often competing, the stories we tell ourselves about other people, about the world, this sort of constant inner dialogue, which of course gives rise to inner feelings about the dialogue. And so most human beings are actually living in that dialogue. So they're living in an alternative reality, right? Or I guess in the computer age we'd call it a virtual reality, right?
Yep. So is that really true? There's so much talk that we are living in. The spiritual talk is that it really is just a virtual reality, and that it's our minds that are creating reality. I mean, what is your perception of that? I mean, are we really just creating our own reality?
Well, not in the way that if I just said, yeah, we're creating our own reality, that would be misleading, because part and parcel of really waking up to reality, what enlightenment is the realization that there really isn't a bunch of separate beings, separate things called you, yous, and me's that go around creating reality. It's the little me doesn't actually create reality. The little me is actually a virtual reality that exists only in the mind. And so from that standpoint, from the standpoint of the me, it can't be creating reality because it itself doesn't actually have any existence outside of the thoughts and conclusions and beliefs that go into making it up. When I'm talking about, I could talk about this on a more ultimate level, but I find that confuses people. But on a simpler level, when I'm talking about what most people view as reality, I'm talking about the psychological. What most people think is their reality is a psychological phenomenon. Mm-hmm. For instance, to bring it down to something that's very simple. Somebody says something to you that you don't like or you don't agree with, and your mind says that person shouldn't have said that. And so then you create a psychological reality. Your reality becomes that person shouldn't have said that. And then your body, of course, will duplicate your thoughts. So you'll start feeling as if somebody shouldn't have said that. You'll feel the anger or the resentment or whatever. And so you'll have thoughts and feelings, and that will be your reality. You will live the reality which is based on a thought that says, so-and-so shouldn't have said that to me.
And when we get caught up in those thoughts, then we're really actually missing the real reality, which is ticking along just fine.
It's ticking along just fine. I mean, in one sense, this is kind of a relative sense, but in a relative sense, reality is simply what's happening. So somebody did say something to you, and that's all. They said something that you liked or you didn't like, but it's the secondary interpretation where most people live their lives, and they're interpreting what happens to them, and then that interpretation is taken to be real. Does that make sense?
It actually makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. And then sadly, then we go along, and our whole lives become living in this constant state of inner interpretation, you know?
Mm-hmm. Which tends to be a lot more miserable than if we just were aligned with reality as it was rolling along.
Exactly. The awakening, certainly the enlightenment part of it, we call it awakening because it feels like that, not because something actually awakens, because reality is already awake, but it feels like, from the standpoint of the person, it feels like one has woken up out of a dream, and the dream we wake up out of is basically this dream of all these living in one's personal psychology and thinking that you are the person that psychology, pertains to. And the awakening is realizing that, number one, that person isn't who you are. That person that you thought you were doesn't actually exist in any way outside of thinking. And the whole world that imaginary person created was virtual. It wasn't actually true. It has nothing to do with reality. And one can understand this intellectually beforehand, but it's something of a different order of magnitude when the experience, or when the actual happening, when you actually find yourself completely outside of it, so that none of your identity is being derived from one's, we could say, personal psychology.
So in speaking to identity, because there's a lot of in your teachings about how we really want to let go of being so identified with ourselves and our roles and so forth. Isn't it useful to have some kind of identity, or is that really what's getting in the way?
Well, see, what let me. I mean, the question's great, but let me sort of reorient the question, because as far as I'm concerned, as a spiritual teacher, the question isn't whether it's useful to have an identity. The question is any identity actually real? You see the difference?
Yeah.
Because, if you're going to be stuck in ego land, right, in the land where you really believe in your identity, I often say to people, look, if you're going to stay stuck in the dream state, it's better that you can dream better.
Right.
You might as well have a better, more highly functional dream. So to have a better identity is more enjoyable than to have a bad identity.
Right.
But enlightenment really isn't about making the dream state better. That may happen as a byproduct. But ultimately, truth isn't really about improving. It's not the motivation to improve anything. Is this whole identity thing, does it have substance? Is there actually an identity that's true? Or is identity itself a fabrication, a psychological phenomenon, and nothing more?
So what is the truth about identity? I mean, that's
the whole point, isn't it? That's the crux of everything, which is why I often return to it in many of the ways that I teach, is because I see that it's the identity that is the crux of everything, because, of course, everybody's life revolves around themselves, right? Even the quest for enlightenment, people, the way that we engage in it from the identity is, I want to be enlightened, right? The identity is actually seeking enlightenment. The irony is that when the enlightenment comes, it is seeing that identity itself is a fabrication, that what we are has nothing to do with an identity. And we only think of it's really hard for people to even think in these terms, because we're literally taught, our minds are conditioned to think about ourselves in terms of an identity. And for most people, it's almost impossible for them to think in terms of what they are, being completely divorced from any notion of identity. You see, it's almost like thought can't do that. So the core of the teaching really is to examine all of anything that we think we are, any piece of our identity, whether it's a negative, very harmful, shameful, guilt-ridden identity, or if it's a very, nicely intact, well-functional, relatively happy identity. The core of spirituality that's really aimed at a real awakening, enlightenment, is really looking right at that identity, because it's that identity that thinks it's the center of the universe, and that's what creates the sense of separateness. And when that identity is at once seen completely through, it is then seen that everything that we ever thought we were wasn't what we were, couldn't be what we were.